What happens when a Hollywood star, someone used to red carpets, bright lights, and award shows, suddenly walks into Judge Caprio's courtroom, not as a guest, not for a cameo, but for something far more personal? Friends, imagine this: a normal day in Providence Municipal Court. The usual rhythm, the bailiff calling names, people shuffling nervously with parking tickets, the quiet buzz of conversation as cases move quickly, one after another. Judge Caprio sits at the bench, warm yet firm, listening carefully to each person before him, offering compassion where it's needed, justice where it's due. Then the doors open, and the room changes. A man steps inside wearing a simple black jacket, sunglasses tucked into his collar, no entourage, no cameras trailing behind. But there's no mistaking that face. The audience freezes. A few people gasp. Someone whispers almost too loudly, "Is that?" It is. A Hollywood legend. But why here? Why today? People start pulling out phones, unsure if they should be filming. Even the clerks glance at each other, eyebrows raised. A star of this magnitude doesn't just wander into a local courtroom on a quiet Tuesday morning. Judge Caprio looks up, curious but calm. "Good morning," he says, the same way he greets everyone. The star nods respectfully. "Good morning, Your Honor." His voice carries the weight of someone used to speaking lines on camera, but this isn't a movie set. This is real. He steps to the podium, hands clasped in front of him, and the room goes silent. People lean forward in their seats. Whatever this is, it isn't about publicity. "I'm not here today as an actor," he begins softly. "I'm here as a son. As a man who made a promise a long time ago." "A promise?" The audience glances at each other, puzzled. "A promise to who?" The star takes a slow breath. "And today," he says, "I need to keep it." The entire room hangs on his words. Because whatever brought this Hollywood icon to Judge Caprio's bench, it isn't fame. It isn't money. It's something deeper. And friends, you won't believe what happened next. Before that moment turned the entire room upside down, the morning had begun like any other in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio, known to millions as the compassionate judge, sat behind the bench, glasses perched low on his nose, scanning the day's docket with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this for decades. He wasn't just a judge, he was a presence. Warmth radiated from him, the kind that made nervous defendants stand a little straighter and speak a little braver. People across the country knew him from viral clips, moments where he waived fines for struggling families, listened patiently to stories others might have dismissed, and turned a courtroom into something more human than legal. He carried the reputation of someone who balanced justice with mercy, a man who could deliver both a smile and a ruling without either feeling out of place. The cases that morning were ordinary. A parking violation here, a traffic ticket there. People filed in nervously, some holding papers with shaking hands, others muttering quiet explanations to family members seated beside them. The court clerks moved with efficiency, calling names, stamping documents, keeping the day moving along. Spectators in the back row, students on a field trip, retirees curious about the process, a few locals waiting for their own hearings, leaned forward whenever Judge Caprio spoke, hoping to witness one of those moments he had become famous for. A kind word, a gesture of understanding, a flash of humor that eased the tension. Everything felt normal. Predictable. Safe. Until the door opened. At first, no one paid much attention. People walked in and out of courtrooms all the time. But then someone recognized the face. A woman near the aisle inhaled sharply. A man in the third row nudged his friend, eyes wide. He was dressed simply, black jacket, dark jeans, no tie. No publicist hovered nearby. No cameras followed. Yet the recognition rippled through the room like a current. Hollywood royalty. But not smiling, not waving, not performing. This was not the charming star from late-night interviews or red carpet premieres. This was someone carrying himself with quiet gravity, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. He walked down the aisle slowly, nodding politely to the bailiff before taking a seat in the front row. For a few moments he said nothing at all. Just sat there, eyes fixed on the bench where Judge Caprio presided, as if waiting for something bigger than his turn on the docket. Whispers began almost immediately. "Is that really him? What's he doing here? Is this some kind of event?" But there had been no announcement. No press release. No charity gala or publicity stunt. Just one man who had lived his life beneath the world's brightest lights. Now sitting quietly in a small Rhode Island courtroom. Judge Caprio glanced up briefly, his expression giving nothing away. He finished the case before him, dismissed the defendant kindly, then looked toward the newcomer with the same calm attention he gave everyone who entered his courtroom. The star rose slowly and stepped to the podium. His movements carried none of the swagger people expected. If anything, there was a weight to them, like each step brought him closer to something he couldn't turn back from. And as he stood there, clearing his throat, the room fell into an almost reverent silence. Because whatever brought him here today, it wasn't fame. It wasn't spectacle. It was something far heavier. The Hollywood guest stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the wood, his eyes scanning the courtroom as if searching for the right words. For a moment he didn't speak at all. He simply looked around, seeing the curious faces staring back at him. The spectators, the lawyers, the clerks pausing their paperwork, and Judge Caprio himself waiting patiently. Finally the actor exhaled slowly. His voice, when it came, was softer than anyone expected. "I know this must look strange," he began. "People wondering what I'm doing here. Why I would come to this courtroom of all places." He paused again as if carefully choosing each word. "This isn't about headlines. It's not about publicity. I didn't call anyone before I came. No one told me to be here." People leaned forward slightly. Even the bailiff, usually expressionless, raised his eyes from the paperwork on his desk. The star shifted his weight, his tone steady but carrying a weight most people in the room couldn't name yet. "Years ago," he said slowly, "someone I loved stood in this very courtroom. Not as a celebrity. Not as anyone the world knew. Just a person, facing something hard." The room stayed silent, hanging on his words. "I couldn't be here then," he continued, his voice low. "I was away filming. Away chasing a career, chasing everything people said mattered. I told myself there would be time to make it right. Time to show up later. But life doesn't always wait." He stopped there, his eyes dropping briefly toward the floor before lifting again to meet Judge Caprio's gaze. "Before they passed," he said softly, "they asked me for one thing. One promise. That someday I'd come back here. Stand where they stood. And say the words they never got to say." A woman in the audience brought a hand to her mouth. Someone else murmured, "Oh my God," under their breath. The judge leaned forward slightly, his face calm but his eyes thoughtful. The star gave a small, almost self-conscious smile. "I know this isn't how court usually works," he said quietly. "But I came today to keep that promise. To say what should have been said years ago." He didn't explain what that was yet. He let the sentence hang there, unfinished, heavy with everything unsaid. And now, everyone, the audience, the clerks, even Judge Caprio himself, waited in absolute silence for what would come next. The star rested his hands on the podium, his eyes locked on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls, as though he could still see the life he had lived. The lights, the cameras, the endless applause, and yet none of it seemed to matter now. "You all know the movies," he began softly. "The premieres. The awards. The interviews where I smiled like I had it all figured out. People looked at me and saw success, glamour, maybe even happiness." He let out a small, humorless laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "What they didn't see," he continued, "was the hotel rooms I came back to after the cameras turned off. Empty. Quiet. The kind of quiet that gets inside your head." A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the story they expected. "I was 21 when the first film hit big," he said. "Suddenly I was everywhere. Magazine covers, talk shows, red carpets in cities I couldn't even pronounce. People said I was lucky. And I was. But luck doesn't teach you how to live." He paused, his jaw tightening for a brief second before he went on. "I miss birthdays. Weddings. Funerals. I told myself I was building a future. I told myself there would be time to go home later." The words "later" hung in the air like a weight too heavy to carry. "One of the people I left behind," he said slowly, "was my father. He was proud of me, told everyone in town about his son in Hollywood. But he worried. Worried that all the lights and fame were changing me. That I was losing the things that mattered." The star swallowed hard before continuing. "We had a fight once, right before I left for another shoot. He told me I didn't show up for people anymore. I told him he didn't understand my world." He shook his head faintly. "Turns out he understood more than I did." The courtroom was silent now. Even the clerk had stopped shuffling papers, her eyes fixed on the man at the podium. "While I was off filming," he said, "he stood in this courtroom. Right here. For a case that wasn't about money or crime. It was about pride. About a neighborly dispute that had gotten out of hand. He wanted to explain himself. To tell his side. But I wasn't here. I didn't even know until later." He paused, his voice dipping lower. "He lost that case. Not because he was wrong, but because sometimes life doesn't wait for you to get it together. The actor's shoulders sank slightly as he said, "We never really talked about it. He passed away a year later. Heart attack. Sudden." A murmur moved through the courtroom, soft, sympathetic, like people couldn't help reacting even though they were strangers. The star looked up, his eyes glistening but steady. "I came back for the funeral. Cameras followed me even then. People said the right things, sorry for your loss. He was proud of you. But none of it fixed the fact that I wasn't here when he needed me." His voice cracked then just enough for everyone to hear the strain. "Before they buried him, I stood by his casket and promised him I'd come back. That someday I'd stand where he stood. That I'd say the things he didn't get to say." The audience leaned forward. Even Judge Caprio sat perfectly still, watching with quiet respect. "And that's why I'm here," the star finished softly. "Because I built a life everyone admired, but I left too many things unsaid. Too many things undone." He looked down at his hands, the silence in the room wrapping around him like a confession finally spoken. The actor stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slightly slumped, the weight of everything he had just shared pressing down on him. The courtroom waited, silent, sensing there was still something he hadn't said yet, something deeper, something that explained why he had come all this way after all these years. He lifted his eyes toward Judge Caprio, his voice steady but softer than before. "There's one thing you don't know yet," he said. "And it's the reason I couldn't stay away any longer." People in the room leaned forward instinctively. "When my father stood here years ago," the actor continued, "he didn't just lose his case. He lost something inside himself. He was a proud man. Worked hard his whole life. Paid his taxes. Helped neighbors fix their roofs. Donated to the church every Christmas. But that day broke something in him." He paused, remembering. "He told my mother later he didn't feel heard. That he walked out of here carrying words he never got to say. Words about why he was angry. Why he was hurt. Why he deserved to be understood." The actor's voice tightened. "He carried those words for the rest of his life. And when he died, they died with him. But I made him a promise, standing by his hospital bed just hours before the end, that I would come back here. That I would speak for him. That before I left this world, I would make sure someone listened." A woman in the second row dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even one of the lawyers shifted uncomfortably, staring down at the floor. The actor drew a breath that sounded heavier than it should have been. "My father used to say something to me when I was a kid. Every time I ran off chasing dreams, every time I packed a suitcase for another film set, he'd say, 'Don't forget where you came from, son. Don't forget the people who raised you.'" His voice cracked just slightly on the next words. "And I did forget. Not on purpose. But I did. I forgot him when he stood here alone." The courtroom was utterly still now. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed muted. "I've spent years pretending success makes up for the things you lose along the way," the actor said softly. "But it doesn't. Awards don't fill empty chairs at the dinner table. Box office numbers don't keep promises." He looked straight at Judge Caprio then, his eyes wet but unflinching. "I came here today because I couldn't stand the thought of leaving this world without keeping the last promise I made to my father. He wanted to be heard. So hear me now, Your Honor. Hear him through me." He gripped the podium tighter as though steadying himself. "He was a good man. The kind of man who taught me to open doors for strangers and never lie to a friend. The kind of man who worked double shifts so I could go to acting school. He deserved better than to leave this world feeling like his voice didn't matter." The audience was motionless. A few people wiped their faces quietly, trying not to make a sound. The actor's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I can't change the fact that I wasn't here when he needed me. I can't change the empty seat he left behind. But I can stand here now in the place where he stood and tell the world, that he mattered. That his life wasn't small. That the things he carried were worth hearing." Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his hands folded, his face unreadable but his eyes shining faintly. The actor let out a shaky breath. "This isn't about reopening a case. This isn't about winning or losing. This is about keeping my word. About making sure my father's story doesn't disappear into the cracks of this courtroom floor." He straightened slowly, shoulders trembling just slightly. "So that's why I'm here. To keep a promise to a man who gave me everything and asked for so little." The silence after those words was absolute. Even the air felt heavier, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak. But no one did. Not yet. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to say. For several moments after the actor finished speaking, Judge Caprio didn't say a word. His hands rested on the bench, his expression calm but heavy with thought. It was the same courtroom he had presided over for decades, the same walls, the same bench, the same routine. But this moment felt unlike any he had ever seen. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying a quiet gravity that made the room lean in. "Sir," he began slowly, "I have listened to thousands of cases in my life. People come here with every story imaginable: hardship, loss, mistakes, hope. But what you brought into this room today, it's something else entirely." The actor stood silently at the podium, shoulders squared, eyes lowered like a man bracing for judgment. Judge Caprio's tone softened. "You came here not for yourself but for someone who can't speak anymore. A man you loved. A man you lost. And you carried his voice back into this room so it wouldn't disappear. That takes courage. That takes love." A murmur ran softly through the audience, not loud enough to break the moment but enough to show they felt it too. Judge Caprio glanced down at the paperwork before him. The legal formalities, the ticket, the reason this man had technically been summoned here today. It all felt so small now compared to what had just unfolded. He looked back up at the actor. "The law tells me to decide cases based on facts, evidence, rules." He paused, his voice firm but kind. "But justice lives in the human heart as much as in the law books. And today justice looks like honoring the promise you kept." The courtroom was utterly silent. "I'm dismissing this case," Judge Caprio said clearly, his words echoing against the walls. "Not because of who you are. Not because of fame. But because sometimes the law must step aside and let compassion lead the way." The actor looked up then, eyes glistening, but he said nothing. Judge Caprio continued, his voice steady. "I hope you leave here knowing you did right by your father. That his story was heard. That it mattered." He leaned forward slightly. "And I hope you carry that peace with you for the rest of your life." Someone in the back started clapping softly. Then another joined. Within seconds the entire room was on its feet, the applause rolling through the courtroom like a wave. The actor nodded once, his jaw tight as though holding back emotion, then stepped back from the podium slowly. Judge Caprio let the moment breathe before speaking one last time. "Case dismissed," he said gently, with respect, with gratitude, and with mercy. The gavel fell softly, not as an ending but like a promise finally kept. As the applause slowly faded, the courtroom didn't return to its usual rhythm right away. People remained standing, some wiping their eyes, others looking quietly at the actor who had just laid his heart bare before them. This wasn't the ending anyone had expected when the day began. It was bigger than the case, bigger than the law itself. Friends, what happened in that courtroom wasn't about fame or movies or the glitter of Hollywood. It was about something far more universal. The things we carry in silence, the words we wish we had spoken, the promises we hope we can still keep before it's too late. The man who had been on billboards and magazine covers, who had walked red carpets and stood before thousands of flashing cameras, had come here not as a star but as a son. And in doing so he reminded everyone watching that no amount of success, no amount of applause, can erase the ache of unfinished goodbyes. Judge Caprio, with the wisdom he's known for, didn't just dismiss a case that day. He did something bigger. He gave space for a story that needed to be heard. He honored the memory of a man long gone, not because the law required it, but because compassion demanded it. And maybe that's the part that stayed with people the most. Because think about it, we live in a world that celebrates winning, achievement, being first, being best. But here was a moment where none of that mattered. A man with all the accolades in the world came back to a small courtroom in Providence to keep a promise to his father. A promise not of wealth or success, but of words left unsaid. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many people walk through life carrying the weight of things they never got to say? How many leave this world wishing they'd made one more call, written one more letter, shown up one more time when it really counted? Friends, maybe that's why this story touches so deeply. Because whether you're a Hollywood star or someone no one recognizes, loss feels the same. Regret feels the same. And love? Love always asks for more time than life gives us. That day in that quiet courtroom, Judge Caprio gave that man and his father what time had stolen. A chance to be heard. A chance for the world to know his story didn't vanish just because his life had ended. And that leaves all of us with a question worth asking ourselves. What promises have we left unkept? What words are we still carrying, waiting for the right moment to speak? Maybe the right moment isn't someday. Maybe it's now. I want to hear from you. If you had been there that day, listening to that man speak for his father, what would you have said to him when it was over? Would you have thanked him? Shaken his hand? Told him his father would be proud? Tell us in the comments. Share the words you think his father deserved to hear. Because you never know, someone out there might need to read them today. And if this story touched you even a little, share it. Share it with a friend, a family member, someone you haven't spoken to in too long. Not for views. Not for clicks. But because maybe it will remind someone to make that call, to send that message, to show up before the chance is gone. The actor walked out of the courtroom that day with no fines, no judgment, no headlines following him. What he left with was something far more valuable, the knowledge that he had kept his promise. That his father's story had been spoken aloud, in the very place where it was once silenced. And as for Judge Caprio, well, even after decades on the bench, some cases stay with you. This one will stay with him. It will stay with everyone who was there. And in our next episode, friends, another case will leave Judge Caprio speechless. A moment so unexpected, so powerful, it brought the entire courtroom to its feet for reasons no one saw coming. Don't miss it.